of the General Counsel. Christina Samuels, Janine Matthew, and Reinhard Breckner work together to identify functions and business practices that require conflict of interest analysis. They basically help researchers understand the need to disclose outside activities and financial interests, and they help guide that process. First, Christina. Christina is the Associate General Counsel for the university. She serves as the legal advisor to the Conflict of Interest Committee and the Institutional Conflict of Interest Committee, in addition to working on all legal matters related to research. She previously practiced law at a New Orleans law firm, and she received her bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt and her law degree from here at Tulane. Christina's fun fact is that she rides in the Iris Carnival Crew parade every year. Next, we have Reinhard Breckner. Reinhard is the Senior Business and Contracts Administrator for the General Counsel's Office. He researches and analyzes conflict of interest matters for the Conflict of Interest Committees. He also manages billing from external legal counsel, the process for contract review, and registration of the university's trademark portfolio. He is also a former law firm administrator, and his educational background is in philosophy, theology, and business. Reinhard's fun fact is that he is fluent in German and Romanian, and his ancestors are from Transylvania. And now for Janine. Janine is a compliance specialist in the General Counsel's office. She administers the conflict of interest data collection process and is on the front line of identifying potential conflict of interest issues for the university. She also supports multiple compliance committees. She works on immigration matters related to requests for permanent residency, and she confirms that all faculty and staff are in good standing with federal programs. Janine's fun fact is that she goes to the gym every day at 6 a.m. So please welcome all three of our speakers.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to start out by giving you all a basic overview of conflicts of interest, and then also provide you with a very high level summary of the regulations that you as researchers are required to comply with, and also us as an institution if you have federally funded research. So can anyone here give me an example of a conflict of interest or describe a situation that might give rise to a conflict of interest in research?
By the drug company that testified.
That's a great example, and one we come across a lot. So a conflict of interest is any circumstance where personal, professional, financial, or other private interests of a person or an institution compromise or have the potential to compromise the exercise of professional judgment or obligations of that individual, or the appearance of doing so. And this is an important point I want to make. You know, we often have researchers who say, yes, I'm being paid by Pharma X on my personal time for speaking engagements, and yes, Pharma X is also supporting my research at Tulane, but I'm not biased. You know, I have integrity. I would never compromise my research. The money I'm making will have no effect on my professional judgment. And while this may be true, and we're not, you know, attacking anyone's integrity, there's still an appearance of a conflict of interest. And so if the investigator failed to disclose the COI and have it managed properly, then someone could later on question the research results. And I'm not sure if anyone saw, I brought a couple of newspaper articles that I can pass around. Last year, there was a New York Times article on a top researcher who failed to disclose his conflicts of interest. And it led to a lot of scrutiny, a lot of public interest, and he had to resign. So here's some examples we can find. So this is why it is important to comply with our COI policy, so you don't end up like this guy. And the bullets on this slide demonstrate the reasons why we've implemented the policy at Tulane. You know, we have an interest in assuring and protecting the integrity of the university and that of our faculty and staff. We want to maintain the high standards of excellence in our work. And of course, we want to be compliant with laws and also ethical standards addressing COIs in academic and research activities. So I will go ahead now and do a quick overview of the federal regulations. The federal regulations that you as researchers and ways an institution are required to comply with are found at 42 CFR Part 50 and 45 CFR Part 94. These regulations were first adopted in 1995 and they were revised in 2011. And the 2011 regulations are still in effect and what we have to all comply with. They apply to all public health services funded research, and they're designed to promote objectivity in research. And I just wanted to point out that the regulations state that they apply to all investigators, but the term investigator as defined in the regulation means the PI or any person, regardless of title or position, who is responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of PHS-funded research or proposals for such funding. So therefore, these regulations could apply to collaborators or consultants or postdocs or grad students or anyone else who falls under this definition. So there's four main things that you as an investigator will need to do to be in compliance with the federal regulations. Become familiar with the revised regulations and Tulane's own policy. You have to complete the COI training at the required intervals, which is at least every 4 years. Disclose your financial interest to Tulane annually and within 30 days of discovering a newly acquired significant financial interest, and then comply with any management plan issued by Tulane and retain documentation of such compliance. And now I will pass the baton over to Janine, who will go over our policy in more detail.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the COI policy and what happens if you are participating in research that is human subjects related. The conflict of interest policy is divided into into 3 parts, Part A, Part C, and Part D. Part A pertains to every faculty and staff member. Part C is applicable to investigators involved in human subjects research, and Part D is for research oversight officials. I know that there are some students in the room, and normally students are not required to complete the COI disclosure form, and this policy wouldn't necessarily be applicable to you. However, if you are an investigator participating in research, regardless of your affiliation, you will have to complete the COI requirements, and this policy would be applicable to you as an investigator. So as Christina talked a little bit about a conflict of interest, this is to expand on what she just discussed. But a conflict of interest arises whenever faculty, staff, or an affiliated investigator's professional interest, such as professional obligations or judgment owed to the university and its constituents, are compromised or could reasonably be perceived as being compromised by his or her leadership roles or financial interests. And this definition is, as you can see, it arises, in the case of public health service funded research, a PHS financial conflict of interest arises when the financial interests of an investigator could directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of PHS funded research. So this is important to understand because there's various understanding of what constitutes a conflict of interest, and the policy goes into great detail about your relationships with healthcare companies, pharmaceutical companies, nonprofits, for-profits, and things of that nature. So the difference between a conflict of interest and PHS financial conflict of interest, our policy is taken from the federal regulation. So, for instance, even with the definition of investigator, that definition that's in the COI policy is directly taken from the PHS, Public Health Service Funded Regulation. Because it's applicable, the university wanted to make sure that we were in compliance with the federal regulation, so that information is directly from the PHS regulation. As Christina said, this is the definition of an investigator. If you are responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of research, you are considered an investigator. It does not matter what your affiliation is. If you have that responsibility on the research protocol, you are considered an investigator and you are required to follow the COI requirements. An affiliated investigator would be anybody who is, other than a faculty or staff member, who also serves as a project director or principal investigator, or again, responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of the research, funded by the PHS and conducted by the university. So we do have, I don't know how many of you are involved in research, but you may have someone who is providing consultancy services on a project who is not a part of Tulane. That would be a person considered as an affiliated investigator if they are responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of the research. And we do have that all the time, and they are bound by they are bound by Tulane's requirements unless we have an agreement, and that's through Sponsored Projects Administration. If we have an agreement with their institution and they have a compliant COI policy, then they are bound by their own institution's COI requirements. But the COI policy or requirements have to be in compliant with the federal regulation. That would be the only way that they could participate on the project and not have to comply with Tulane's conflict of interest requirements. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what happens when something is submitted to the IRB, a research protocol is submitted to the IRB, if you are participating in human subject research. In a part of the application is important that the individuals are listed correctly, meaning if you are a grad student and you are just considered research personnel, you will be just doing some sort of administrative type work on this particular project. You're not considered an investigator. And if you are tagged as an investigator, you're listed as an investigator on the research project, you will have to complete the COI requirements. So it is important that you list or people are indicated in the correct role so that they're not subjected to all of the COI requirements and the same scrutiny if they don't have to be. There are two requirements. Christina touched on somewhat both of them, but the first thing that you should be required to do is to complete the COI disclosure form. It's an electronic form, and in the beginning I talked a little bit about parts A, part C, and part D, which is applicable to all faculty and staff, investigators, and research oversight officials. For those of you who are participating in research and have been with Tulane for more than 2 years, you experience the difference. We just went to a new platform 2 years ago, and we actually merged all three components of the form. So in the past, and that's why I wanted to kind of explain the different parts, but in the past, there were 3 parts that you had to complete if you were an investigator participating in research. You had to complete part A, which was for everybody, and then you had to do part C, which was only for investigators participating in research, and it was research-related questions. And then there was part D if you were a research oversight official. And then we had a part where it was an attestation form, which allowed you to provide specific information about the study itself. Having said that, we've merged the form into one just like questionnaire. So we hope that it's for you guys who experienced the old form versus the new form that we're using now, that it's much more user-friendly in the sense that it prompts you, do you have this? If you say no, you skip a bunch of questions and go to the next thing instead of having to answer every single question. So we tried to make the flow of the form better so that if there were things that were not applicable to you, you didn't have to bother about answering because it would just skip over based on their yes or no response. For those of you who may have things to disclose, like your financial interests, leadership roles, secondary commitments, things of that nature, there is a pretty long table. Some of you may have experienced what that table looks like. There's a pretty long table only because the more information that you explain, the less, it's easier to understand what the relationships are and then to determine if there is a conflict of interest and if there needs to go any further with it. So we understand that the table is long, but again, it allows you to explain what your relationships are. And the neat part about the platform is that when you complete it, like, let's just say this is your first year completing it this year. When you go to complete it next year, all you have to do is pretty much copy. It's going to copy the information. You will have to still go through the form, but you would only need to update or change answers or do whatever. So it's not like you have to keep answering the same things over and over again. So that's the beauty of this particular platform. And we hope that individuals who's had the opportunity to use it for the last 2 years found that to be a really great feature. Also, city training, if you are participating in research, you have to complete the city FCOI training. This training was required for anyone who anyone who was participating in public health service, PHS funded research. The university decided to adopt it to make every investigator have to complete city FCOI training. It's required every 4 years. So, if you took it when this rule first was announced, which was in 2011, everybody had to be compliant by 2012. So in 2012, everyone who was participating in research had to complete this training. City is the platform. It's not that City makes this up, but City is the platform that most people use. If you are an investigator, a non-affiliated investigator participating in research at Tulane, if you've done this training at your home institution, one of the, let me get to the next slide. So these are the 3 modules that you would have to complete. If you are a non-affiliate and you've completed the training at your own institution and you are participating in research at Tulane, when you go into City, it allows you to decide what institution is your learning institution. If you change it to Tulane and you've taken it at your own institution, if you notice the 3rd module is conflict of interest mini course, institution specific policies. So that course is basically to allow the individual to understand or have knowledge on Tulane's conflict of interest policy. So once you log into City, you change your learner's institution to Tulane, you will only have to take the 3rd module, which is conflict of interest mini course specific to the institution's policy. Even if you go to another institution, if you are participating in research, you go over to LSU or wherever, you would do the same thing. Log into City, choose that institution, and if you've already taken the courses at your own institution, you would only be responsible for taking the course that's relevant to that institution's conflict of interest policy. Does anybody have any questions?
How many years this one is running?
4. Every 4 years you are required to.
This closure has to be every year?
I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was on one of the slides, but the COI disclosure form is an annual form that must be completed every year by January 31st. If you are a new employee, it's due 60 days from your date of hire. If you acquire any new acquisition or if you become involved in any sort of new leadership role that meets the definition of a leadership role, then you would have to update your COI form within 60 days of acquiring or being involved in that leadership role. And I always tell people when they call and ask, what should I do? I'm thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. It's to err on the side of caution. If you know that you will be participating in some sort of event, or you will start providing consultancy services for some pharmaceutical company or something of that nature, and you are participating in research, even if it has not happened, you can always go in and update your form and indicate that this is something that's potentially going to happen. So to make sure that you stay in compliance with that 60-day window. So if there is once the forms are reviewed and a conflict of interest is discovered, or there's a potential conflict of interest, because a conflict of interest, it may be actual or it may be perceived. So even if you have a conflict of interest or potential, and it's not really a conflict of interest, but the reasonable person can look at that and say, I feel like this is a conflict of interest, then it will probably go to the COI committee, and a management plan will probably be communicated to that individual. So it's not only about having an actual, it's also the perception of a conflict of interest. When the COI committee reviews a potential or actual conflict of interest, the process is the person is contacted. They have an opportunity to review the analysis that's written up, which includes all the facts and relevant information to their potential conflict of interest. And then the person is invited to either attend the conflict of interest committee's meeting in person or via phone in case the COI committee has any questions, or that person wants to present their case or more information to the COI committee. So basically, they have the opportunity to go in front of the committee and discuss whatever it is. Prior to the meeting, they are made aware of a potential management plan, which I'll talk about toward the end. But it's when it goes before the committee, the person already knows what the nature of the conflict is or the potential. They already know what the possible management plan could be. The committee's purpose is not to hinder research, but it's to encourage research and find a way to manage it if that's possible. And so pretty much for the most part, I don't think we've had maybe one that was not really manageable. And at that point, after discussion with the principal investigator, that individual decided to turn the study over to someone else. So pretty much, there's usually a way to manage it in some sort of way that's amicable for the university as well as the principal investigator. I'm going to briefly touch on open payments. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of open payments data, if you're familiar with the Sunshine Act previously. But open payments is a congressionally mandated disclosure program that promotes a more transparent and accountable healthcare system by making the financial relationships between applicable manufacturers and group purchasing organizations and healthcare providers available to the public. So in essence, there is a website, and it's in this PowerPoint. I'm sure that this is going to be made available to everyone. So there's a website for those of you who are not familiar with what this is, where you can go in and look up any physician from anywhere to see what they've been paid by pharmaceutical companies. It will list, there's a lot of information on that website. It will list how much they've received in consultancy fees, how much they've received in gifts, honoraria, meals. It lists a whole host of information. And so the government felt that it was only fair that individuals understand what their physicians are receiving from pharmaceutical companies. So at the end of the slide, there is a website that we will provide so that if anybody wants to go look at it, you can. But it's public accessible, and that was the whole point to this, to make it accessible to the public so that people can go in and understand the relationships of the physicians that's providing services to them or physicians that's also conducting research that they are involved in. And I'm going to turn it over to Reinhard to discuss the scenarios. Does anybody have any questions thus far?
So just to break the presentation up and give examples of conflicts, we're going to stream all episodes of Star Wars now. That's just an attempt to humor. Failed. But no, actually, before we speak about examples, I realized that this is the second time we do this presentation to this group, and I don't know that we address anything about the Conflicts of Interest Committee, and I think it bears mentioning that the Conflicts of Interest Committee is made up of individuals who are highly paid by research funds. So instead of research funding going to you, it goes to the No. In fact, there are all volunteer faculty and staff members from the university community who historically have put in a great deal of effort to be as objective as possible and understanding as possible. And one of the clauses in the COI policy actually requires that The COI committee is made up of from a cross-section across the university. So there are individuals with a legal background, individuals with a scientific background, and I mean by that non-medical science, as well as physicians and staff members who are involved in technology transfer, responsible conduct and research, etc. So that's just a matter of background to.
How many people are on this committee?
At any given moment.
Well, right now, it's about 10 individuals. We have to have 5 for a quorum, so we try to make sure enough people.
So I don't know that we've ever had 14 at any given meeting, but we have to have 5 for the requirements of the policy to for them to make any decisions. Like I said, they have to have 5. Okay, so examples actually came up a minute ago because one of our colleagues in the audience mentioned precisely this type of scenario. So let's say you have now practiced in your field extensively, or you haven't, but you're a genius and you have published and you are a well-known expert, and there is a pharma out there who desperately wants your input and so invites you to become part of their advisory board or one of their advisory boards. You receive compensation from said pharma for your service on the advisory board. And at the same time, that pharma also sponsors research. Let's say the efficacy of any particular drug that the pharma manufactures. And you also are involved in that particular research that the pharma sponsors at the university. The reason the asterisk is there on the Tulane side is obviously if somehow or other you are involved with that research and it has absolutely nothing to do with Tulane or your responsibilities at Tulane, that is not the scenario we're discussing here. So given that background, what we're showing here in this presentation is simply the thought process that would normally go through the minds of a reasonable observer, right? So if the drug manufacturer stands to benefit from the research, which I don't think anybody disputes that, and we all know that there's enough news coverage about how rapacious drug companies are. Unfortunately, probably not nearly enough coverage on how successful they are in developing new drugs, thanks to researchers such as yourself. But since the drug manufacturer does stand to benefit from the research, and you as the investigator have received payment for serving on the drug pharma's advisory board, which per the federal regulations and the COI policy would be considered a research financial interest. And in fact, your serving on an advisory board would also be considered a leadership role. Therefore, it stands to reason that an observer could possibly interpret your involvement with that pharma, or specifically your financial interest or leadership role with that pharma, as possibly compromising your primary responsibilities towards the institution, which would be your professional interests. So that's basically the thought process in how the committee concludes, okay, yes, this is a conflict of interest. More specifically, if in fact we were just talking about a drug, and let's say that the research is in fact a clinical trial, for example, and there are human subjects involved, then and this is something that the majority, if not all, and Christina can correct me if I'm wrong, research institutions adhere to, if in fact the financial interest exceeds $10,000, and that's $10,000 in the 12 months prior to the disclosure, and there is human subjects research involved, then that is considered a per se conflict of interest. So there is no deliberation, as it were, on the side of the committee on whether this really is or not. It's just a given that it's considered to be one. And at that point, the investigator really is not supposed to be involved in the research unless that conflict is obviously eliminated or reduced to below 10,000. However, there is an exception, and that is if there are compelling and necessary reasons for that investigator to be involved in the research, such as unique expertise in the community where the research takes place, or the facilities. Let's say, for instance, we're at Tulane. Tulane is uniquely qualified to have this particular research conducted here, or there are specifics in the Metro New Orleans community and population that make this the ideal place for the research to be conducted. Those are the types of things that the investigator would bring to the committee and say, look, here are compelling and necessary reasons why I should be involved. And in that case, the committee then proceeds to do what my colleague Janine described earlier, that is issue a COI management plan, most likely, and Janine will talk about that after the next example. So that's one of the examples that the committee encounters quite frequently, or an example of what the committee encounters quite frequently. Another example is one that involves intellectual property, and the more the university aspires to foster innovation and research and the spin-off possibly of startup companies as a result of discoveries and innovation, the more likely it is for these types of scenarios to come before the committee. So the scenario here is that an investigator invents and assigns a particular technology to the university. The university generally obtains and owns the patent to that technology. And the investigator who co-founded that company, or I'm sorry, the investigator who invented the technology co-founds and has therefore a financial interest in the startup company in order to commercialize the technology, which is ultimately the goal of the invention, obviously. Subsequently, the university licenses that technology to the startup that the investigator started. So in some instances, investigators invent something, the intellectual property, meaning that invention, is patented by the university, but then the inventor removes herself or himself and does not really have any involvement any longer with any spin-off company. But in the instances where the inventor remains involved with the startup as a result of the invention, obviously that inventor has either an equity or, if nothing else, has a title of CEO or Chief Scientific Officer usually, or some other involvement. If then the startup either receives funding and subawards some of that funding to the university, or vice versa, the university receives funding and subawards some of that funding to the startup, and the investigator is also involved in that research, while at the same time being involved with the startup, obviously that is where the conflict of interest could potentially arise. So the thinking, of course, once again goes that the startup obviously stands to benefit from the research that's conducted at Tulane, whether they are the primary recipients of the funding, or they are themselves receiving funding from the university as sub-recipients. And the investigator is involved with the startup, receives payment from the startup, or even if she or he is not receiving payment, is in a leadership position there, then it stands to reason again that there may very well be somebody who can reasonably conclude that the professional interests of that investigator might be compromised by her or his involvement in the startup. The one thing I would like to mention before I pass the laser beam, apparently there is one, back to my colleague, is that these are valuable contexts to keep in mind, even if you at this moment in your career aren't necessarily in that position. You may be working for someone who is in that position. So you may be working, you may not be the PI, but you may be working for a PI who is in a position similar to the one we described. And you'll see one of the management plan elements, we address speaks exactly to that. So, Janine?
So one of the main things that we experience, or not we, but the committee experiences, that when we have investigators who participated in human subject research, because of their expertise, the pharma company may want them to be a speaker, for instance, and they're receiving personal compensation for their work, which is outside of Tulane. So again, understand if they're speaking on behalf of the university and they receive payment, but it goes to the university, that does not indicate or constitute a conflict of interest. The conflict of interest occurs if they are participating in the research and the pharma company is funding their research, or they have a leadership role with that pharma company that's outside of their responsibility at Tulane. And if that actually happens, the university, the policy allows for you to receive less than $10,000, which is considered a de minimis amount. So let's just say you are a speaker for Pfizer. Pfizer's funding your research. This goes to the committee. They review it and say, okay, this is a de minimis amount. The person only received $5,000 in the previous 12 months. One of the things that they would issue, if you look at the first one. Well, I'll go through all of these, but I can tell you what the committee will do. And one of the elements that's on the management plan is that they would require you to disclose to the participants through the informed consent process. So any of you who are familiar with the IRB submission, the application, there's a spot on there that says potential conflict of interest. That is where the person would for instance, disclose and make a statement such as the principal investigator is an occasional speaker for the funding source. And it's just a simple statement. The committee does not feel that it's necessarily required for the person to disclose the amount. That would be a conversation if the participant would ask, how much did you get? Then at that point, the investigator could tell them at that point. They would also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Speaking fees versus expenses, I mean, $10,000 sounds like a lot unless you start to think international, and then $10,000 can go really fast. So
if we're talking about speaker fees and travel, reimbursement for like travel and incidental, that's two different categories. Actually, the federal regulation has not been very specific about compensation for travel. And so what the committee will do, will look at the amount of travel that a person's received to see if it's out of line with, the services that they're performing. Obviously, if you're getting $30,000 or $40,000 in travel, that would raise a red flag. So it's not that travel would be considered as two separate questions that are asked, so that the committee can clearly understand how much is actually received for speaker fees versus travel reimbursement. So it is two different things. But in any case, in the event that happens, you will be required to disclose to the participants in the informed consent process and disclose in publication. If for some reason, and this does happen, that you did not realize that you needed to disclose the relationship and you have to do it after the fact, you will still be obligated to inform the participants, because what we try to communicate to individuals when they call and ask questions is that if you are participating in a study and something adverse happens to one of the participants and you did not tell them, oh, by the way, I'm a speaker for the same drug that's being used in this study. And so it goes to litigation. They find that out. You can see how that would turn really ugly really fast. If the participants are aware in the very beginning and they can ask questions, you're fully disclosing to them that you do have this outside relationship, and the burden is on the participants to ask any additional questions that they would like to ask.
what if you write a book and it becomes a bestseller and suddenly there's a lot of money involved?
The book would not, it's not, it would be in the previous 12 months, but that's not considered a leadership role for one. It is a financial interest in a sense, but is it related to your research?
Yeah,
And-
write a book about the research.
Right, but
And it just happens to
You have
sell.
to disclose the fact that you had a conflict of interest. That would be one of the
that you have a
requirements.
relationship, correct. So disclosure is, in any case, in any part of the management plan, it's always going to be where you have to disclose either to the publication or through the publication or to the participants. Either way, you do have to make disclosures. One of the things that Reinhardt touched on was if you are participating in research and the PI has a conflict. You're a grad student, you're working on the project. He owns the company, Tulane has the license technology, and his company is involved in the research. One of the elements that would have to happen is that a conversation would be held with you and a member of the COI committee and the chair of the department, so that you understand what that person's relationship is and that you are not, thank you. And so this is one of the management elements, is that we would explain the potential COI. We would instruct the grad student to maintain rigorous, contemporaneous documentation of his or her research, meaning the use of unmodified laboratory notebooks that are periodically reviewed by the department chair, and instruct the person to communicate any concerns about pressure or perceived pressure to produce certain results to department chair or office of the general counsel. So that would be something that would happen if the PI in the research had some involvement with the company that was being, that's also part of the funding source, and if you were participating. I'm going to go back. So some of the elements of the management plan that's in the policy, and these are elements, this is not everything that could happen, but these are some of the things that the COI committee could use when developing a management plan and to communicate to the individual. It'd be changing the responsibility of a conflicted investigator, referring the study to non-conflicted investigators at the university. We have had this happen where the individual felt they did not want to relinquish their role with the funding agency, so they turned the study over to another individual at Tulane. So that has happened, and it was the person's choice, because the COI committee will try to do whatever they can to manage the conflict. And again, as I stated earlier, the conversation is had prior to the COI committee with the individual. So that way, the person's not surprised when the committee comes back and say, okay, these are the things that you would need to do in order to manage the conflict. And normally they usually agree to it prior to the COI committee. Of course, the proposed management plan is what's communicated. We pretty much, meaning the support staff, when we're presenting and preparing the analysis, have a good understanding of what possible solutions could happen. But of course, once it gets to the committee, it's their decision as to what elements they want to impose. But pretty much, we have a very good understanding, and so we're able to communicate that to the person so that they have a full understanding before it actually goes to the committee. Another, as I indicated, would be public disclosure of the conflicting financial interest or leadership role, and then arranging for periodic review of progress reports by non-conflicted peer researchers, updating of information relating to the COI if it appears that the COI might change in any appreciable way over the course of the study. And we do tell them in the COI, in the committee's letter, that you cannot normally, if it's a de minimis amount they've received under $10,000, the committee will say you cannot receive more than $10,000 until you are finished with the study. So they can keep working for the company as long as the amount is below $10,000. They can't receive over that. If they receive more than that, then the COI committee would have to look at it again. They would have to demonstrate compelling and necessary exceptions as to why they need to continue their participation in the study. And we do have a few people where that's happened, where they've been able to demonstrate they're experts in their field. They really need to participate in this research. And so the committee has said, we understand. And just so you understand, you can't just say, I'm an expert, I need to do this. So there's due diligence that's performed. The COI staff, committee staff usually go in and we will confirm that that is the case. So it's not, we have to be able to document why this happened. If some regulatory agency comes in, we want to be able to say, we allowed this and this is why this happened. I think we went over this one. And so this is a slide that has all the websites and contact information. If you are bored and you want to go read the COI policy, please feel free to do so. The COI website, where you will need to go in and complete or update your COI form. If you need to contact COI, that's the email address. I did not put the phone number on there. I apologize for that. But look, you can look me up. Call me anytime if you prefer not to email. And I'm really quick in responding. I'll call you back right away or respond to your email right away. Even if you think you're trying to understand, is this really a conflict? I'm not really sure. I want to know before I start the research or whatever. Or you have individuals who are participating in your research and you want to make sure that completed the COI requirements. I do get that request a lot, where someone may say, look, I'm about to do this research project. I want to make sure all these people completed their requirements. Can you check? So I will definitely check and let you know if they've done it, if they haven't, so that you can reach out to them. It just makes the process that much quicker when you go to the IRB, because the first thing that happens when you submit your application is it's cleared for COI. So if you have not, or any of the key personnel on the project has not completed the COI requirements, it stops right there. And normally, if there's anybody on the project, I'll reach out to them, copy the PI, say, look, this is what you need to do. You need to do it by this date, or it will not be reviewed by the IRB. So that's the first thing that has to happen is the COI check, because what's the point of going forward if there's some COI issues that need to be addressed on the front end? Joe Freeman, he's a law professor at Tulane Law School. He's the COI committee chair. Christina, as you know, is this committee's legal advisor. Reinhardt and I support staff. I've also included the link to city training for the FCOI training course related to COI. And then the last website is the Open Payments Data website, which, I'm sure many of you, if you haven't looked at it, you might now, because there's a lot of information on the website that, many people will find interesting, whether their own personal physicians, what they're receiving, or whether the physicians that they work with are receiving from pharma companies. Does anybody have any questions? I know we gave a lot of information and hopefully it was beneficial. Hopefully you will go to the COI policy and if not, read the whole thing, but familiarize yourself with Part C if you guys are participating in research, so you understand your obligations as far as your research financial interests, any leadership roles, and any secondary commitments. So I would just encourage you, if nothing else, just go look up the definition. If you have any questions about anything that's in the policy, definitely email or call our office. We'll be more than happy to, answer as best we can with the information that you provide and assist you in any way that we can. Thank you.
Any other questions for our doctors today? Well, thank you, Janine, Reinhardt, and Christina. And for our students and attendees here, we have sign-in sheets. You only need to sign that if this is the first time that you have come to a class. Everyone else can just come up front and we'll swipe the IDs like we usually do. In the presentations we put on the researcher's blind website.
How's summer? More rafting got back from Colorado. Yeah, it's been a couple days there. Hiking. So beautiful out there. And you forget there's like blue skies and fresh air. So I'm actually starting a project Sunday. And go very First you do eye projection, go in, cross over, tie a little knot around it, cut it off. Throw it up and do like staples. It's so tiny, it's like the tip of a ball. Hey.
Yeah, I can imagine they use nice, right?
All right, well, good for you. We do it for the rats too, but I'm going to Thanks. Some should just put a note. Just put a note on there so that we can. No, on the. K is 11. Yeah,
People actually talk about it.
Thank you.
Have those books been good? I think.
I thought you left already. Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
And you can use it.
All right.
Oh, I didn't set off alarms or anything.
You just popped up, that's all.
Cool.
No restrictions,
y'all later.
no burn.
Hey, you're actually family. I have a question about this.
Yeah, what's up?
I just found out that we have one of my lab's animals going up to Baton Rouge